would fight. But obviously he was wrong. So I'm left again to ask of those who argue that we should stay, how many more generations of America's daughters and sons would you have me send to fight Afghanistan's civil war when Afghan troops will not? How many more lives, American lives, is it worth? How many endless rows of headstones at Arlington National Cemetery? I'm clear on my answer. I will not repeat the mistakes we've made in the past.
Hello and welcome to Global Chit Chat, our weekly show where we analyze the biggest developments across the globe in the last 7 days. With me, I have on this show our guest and expert, Tridivesh Singh Maini. Thank you, sir, for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So I'll just dive right in because, of course, the biggest developments the world is watching now is happening in Afghanistan with the Taliban takeover of the capital, Kabul. They're in the seat of power amid a very hurried US exit, because of which, Biden, the president there, who's been in charge, watching over this departure, has been heavily criticized for allegedly abandoning the Afghans. But he's defended himself, saying that the America's purpose was never nation building in Afghanistan. So what do you make of the situation that's unfolding in Afghanistan right now? And what do you make of America's position on it?
So first of all, America's position is predictable because, they were not going to say that publicly, at least, the Biden administration was not going to say that they made a mistake. In fact, they're trying to say that what President Biden said was that he doesn't want his successor also to face similar problems, and he had to pull. He had no other option. And Biden also emphasized on how many, how much the US had actually invested in Afghanistan in training the defense forces, and over 20 years, how the number of troops, US troops, who have lost their lives and things like that. So that reaction was predictable. But I think what is interesting is it's very tough. I think a lot of people, every day we are seeing forecasts and predictions that this is going to happen, that is going to. Predicting Afghanistan, the only prediction which is proven to be right is that, it's easy to get in, but it's very tough to get out. Right. So that cliched sort of adage, that has basically been proven right. And we need to divide this whole analysis basically into layers. So the US reaction was predictable. And obviously, this has been compared to the US's Saigon moment. They've said this is similar to what happened in 1975, right? And then you have images of Afghans clinging on to US warplanes and things like that. Now, there is no doubt about the fact that the US has been in decline. US power has been in decline in recent years. But now that brings us to the question that what are the alternatives, right? So that brings us then to the next part about, the great powers. Basically, when we talk about Afghanistan, we talk of Afghanistan in terms of the great game. Now, the nature of the great game has changed. The world order has also witnessed a shift even in the last 20 years. But the question which we need to ask is that even if, let's say, as I said earlier, that the US has been in decline, and there have been within the US a number of analysts who say that when you refer to this term called imperial overstretch, that you overstretch yourself beyond your capacities, that leads to the sort of decline of great powers, right? Now that part is one part. Now the other thing is, does the US decline mean that anybody has a clear answer, to resolving the current, to deal with the current turbulence? For that, the jury is out. And maybe for that, we need to move to the next part, which is about what role can Russia and China, along with other countries, I mean, what role are they likely to play in Afghanistan?
Correct. So China has already warmed to Taliban. They're making overtures. Russia has also said the Taliban, it's welcomed the Taliban rule over there, despite its defeat, the Soviet defeat back in the 1980s. How do you read this? Do you think China is going to take the
So
place?
again, if you notice, so the Taliban delegations, they visited both Russia and China in July, right? So obviously, if you look at the back channel, it was much stronger. I mean, Russia and China had a much stronger back channel. But at the same time, you also see the Russian foreign minister saying that, the signals from Taliban are positive, based on the press conference yesterday, that the Taliban made the right noises with regard to women and some other issues, which basically, now, obviously, even if you look at the press conference, the Taliban essentially, they said that we've not really, our basic principles, our basic tenets remain the same. But, this is part of sort of real politics. And so what they said was that, they basically made some right noises about women and about the media, while also saying that, you need to work in national interest, right? So reacting to that, the Russian foreign minister said that these signals are positive. And obviously, he wasn't only commenting on this, it's based on the back channel which they had as well. But you need to remember a few things, which we forget. Now, one part of this whole thing in Afghanistan, I mean, it's ironical. If you look at Kissinger's outreach towards China, it was to basically cut the sort of then USSR to size, because to exploit the sort of fault lines between China and the Soviet Union. Now today, China and Russia are on the same page vis-a-vis the US. So a number of analysts have obviously been talking about Kissinger's policy being responsible for China's economic growth and China's rise in recent years. Basically, that the US was excessively soft on China. But also, I mean, it's ironical now. This symbolically, this is very important that the US, that Russia and China are on the same page vis-a-vis the US in Afghanistan as of now. At the same time, I think the Chinese also know this. The Russians also know this. That nobody can, there is this vacuum which needs to be filled, and nobody is in a position to really fill it. And I can assure you that even this whole thing of black and white, that China and Russia on one side, US on the other, then, China add Iran and Pakistan to the China-Russia camp, and then India and the US on one hand. I mean, even that is not really going to work. I mean, when you look at it in the short run, yes, there are narrow geopolitical concerns and everything. But in the long run, there will be certain areas where you need to work together. And I may also add that there are also fault lines between China and Russia as well. So Central Asia is one issue, for example, which is going to be a problem. I mean, Central Asia becomes even more important strategically now. So obviously there are differences between Moscow and Beijing. Now, this is one reason why a number of analysts had advised the Biden administration also to have a different approach vis-a-vis Russia from that of China. So coming back to the Afghanistan issue, I think Beijing also realizes that, so what they have said is they want friendly relations with the Taliban. But the problem is that you can have, other countries can make economic investments and everything, but nobody really is in a position to invest in security. I mean, if you look at the investment over 20 years, which the US made through, the financial and logistical and everything, that nobody's in a position. So that is where you need to wait and watch, and you actually need to see that has the Taliban sort of learned its sort of lessons from the past? Is it actually Not just, see, one thing is moderating the stance over certain issues, but politically, as players, are they more astute? I mean, naturally, they have leveraged on their strength, and you can't sort of now say that they're naive or something. But how will this sort of arrangement work out? And that is when, accordingly, the reactions have to be very deft. They have to be very nimble. But the focus, I think, what is happening right now is that two mistakes which you are making. One, making a prediction or making forecasts is hazardous. I mean, you can only basically highlight some of the trends. Second, I think we are overdoing some of the analysis is focusing a bit too much on this China versus US sort of binary. It's important, and we also need to remember that China also is going to make an entry through the back door. It's not directly, basically because Afghanistan has no alternative. That is why it's not, and its entry is going to be very different from the US entry into Afghanistan. And obviously, its approach towards other issues like the US has put on human rights and everything like that. China will have a different approach. China's main concern is about Xinjiang, right? So the Great Power tango, which is going on, it's important, but the analysis should not be restricted to that. Okay. Then the next part which you need to see is that I mean, couple of other things which are important, that you need each country, Western countries, India, some of the other democracies and all, they have their short-run concerns. So obviously the first is evacuation of all citizens and all. That has been done mostly. You've got the citizens out from there. Then obviously in terms of human rights, in terms of women's. So if you see the statements coming from the EU, if you see a statement signed by 60 countries about the security of ordinary people and everything, the tone is very different. So that is one area where there's going to be a major difference between some of the Western countries and China and Russia, because the priority, the emphasis on human rights and things like that naturally will be much more, right? So, right. And then of course you have the long run. Now the long run, as I said, you cannot be very reactive right away. You will see how things turn over the next few days. Some right noises have been made. The fact that the Taliban actually allowed, even though, I mean, the leaders to actually, basically peacefully move out from Afghanistan without any bloodshed and all. So there are some signs, but to jump to any conclusion that, the Taliban has totally changed or to predict Armageddon, both at this point of time are hazardous.
Right, so that was very nuanced. I would like to come to the next part of this. I have a question on, of course, India's position in all of this. What does it all mean for India, and whether they have to worry about Afghanistan being taken over by Islamist terror, China's strengthening in this South Asian region. What does it all mean for India?
So again, this needs to be looked at. The Indian concerns need to be looked at various levels. So one, as I said, the short run part is more or less that has been, I mean, obviously it's been totally, you brought all your diplomats or journalists and everything. The evacuation has been done. Now, when you look at the geopolitics of South Asia itself, naturally, if you look at the links between the Pakistani deep state and the Taliban, they're a major cause of concern. So that's one layer, the security part, and the fact that obviously Pakistan's, if you look at Pakistan's reaction, I mean, the Pakistan PM and senior ministers also, they have welcomed the Taliban. But here also I would like to add another note. Pakistan has also said that as far as recognition is concerned, they'll wait for other, which means basically they're obviously waiting for China and for Russia, and then they'll go ahead with the recognition of that whole thing. Right. Now, so what is done now, right? And so we don't live in a perfect world. Now, you cannot really dictate how any other country deals with the Taliban, how Taliban is, or Taliban's foreign policy for that matter. But what you can see is you can look for some of the windows. Now, Taliban has first, I think, statement has come out that they want good relations. Now, obviously, they didn't want to be explicit and say only with China, Pakistan, whatever, but basically, there's a hint towards the neighborhood as such. That's the first part. The second part is that India, as you know, has made investments, numerous investments in the past, and obviously, India would want to secure these. And Taliban also would not want to be too dependent only on China. So obviously the primary dependence will be on China, but not 100%. I mean, they would also want that the foreign policy is reasonably diversified. So there's definite space over there. And if they are pragmatic, yes, somehow the other through the back channels and all, a working relationship is possible. The most important factor is Iran now for India. I think, as I said, maybe some opportunities have been lost in terms of back channel and whether we were prompt enough to react to the changing situation. And that's, a lot of analysts have spoken about that. But you have to look for opportunities. One more opportunity is Iran. Now, Iran has said that India and Iran will play an important role in the security situation, in this basically providing security and everything in Afghanistan. The new president, who people otherwise are very wary of, that he's conservative and he's hardliner. He has on August 6th, he had made a remark that India and Iran can basically work together. Now, obviously, India has invested also in the Chabahar port. The main aim of the Chabahar port was only access. I think the India-Iran relationship becomes even more important in such a situation. It's one of the important factors, right? And what you also did, then I think if Iran can play some sort of positive role, it can act as an intermediary between India and the Taliban. I think India also needs to probably push to play a more proactive role along with other US allies to work towards giving Iran some face saving with regard to the nuclear deal.
And can I throw in one last short question here? The Taliban has said, ANI reported that the Taliban said that Kashmir will remain a bilateral issue, but there's no more elaboration on that. How do you read this?
So I think, again, if you look at the Indian side, actually that's a concern. As I said about the proximity between Pakistan, the Pakistani deep state and the Taliban, and that is the main concern. But as I said, I think, the Taliban at this point of time has numerous, if you look at the foreign policy, if you look at other economic challenges, geopolitical challenges, I don't think that it would be it's a bit premature to really make any prediction on, because that's why I was saying about even the Afghanistan-India relationship. For all, if they are pragmatic, they will dehyphenate it to whatever degree possible from their relationship with Pakistan. Now, this seems impossible, but to ensure that they're not totally dependent upon China or they don't totally fall into one camp, which, most IR analysts, most commentators would like to, simplify this and say that one great power is one, they'll totally fall into the Chinese orbit or something. If they have changed and going by what some of the statements are emanating, they would not like to fall into any one orbit. And also they would, within South Asia also, there will be some sort of dehyphenation. And they cannot, after all, totally ignore, because if they've spoken about China's role in reconstruction, economic development, I don't think that in the long run they can really ignore even India's sort of role. And one more thing, that in spite of all the rivalries and tensions between India and China, till 2018, I think, for instance, there was talk about even cooperation between India and China and Afghanistan. So while there are issues, I mean, over CPEC and BRI, there are issues over India and China, but on capacity building, logistics, one can't even rule that out. Some space is there for India-China cooperation, even in Afghanistan. Because see, the security, as I said, China also faces a security threat as well in many ways. So nobody would want that. I mean, Beijing wouldn't mind cooperation in certain areas with New Delhi, which benefits both sides in Afghanistan as well, especially capacity building and logistics.
Right, sir. So thanks very much for breaking all of that down in a very nuanced way on this show of Global Chit Chat. So, and to our viewers, thank you for tuning in, and do stay tuned for our next show next week.